Welcome to my channel of Gil Master Stories. Don't forget to subscribe button and press on the bell icon for more inspiration and mind-blowing stories. Struggling to keep his bakery alive and care for his sick wife, Jim never expected a quiet stranger to walk in and change his life forever with a single act of extraordinary kindness. It was early morning in Bakersfield, California, and the air inside Jim's homestyle bakery carried the faint aroma of freshly baked donuts and bread, but despite the inviting smells, Jim Lee Chong looked anything but cheerful. His once proud bakery, tucked between a laundromat and a hardware store, had seen better days. The once steady stream of customers had slowed to a trickle. The economy wasn't helping, and neither were his mounting personal struggles. Jim, 58, was no stranger to hard work. For decades, he and his wife Linda had run the bakery together. Linda's laughter used to fill the tiny kitchen in the back, her touch evident in every delicately frosted cake and every batch of cookies that left their shelves. But now the laughter was gone. Linda had been diagnosed with a rare and aggressive illness 6 months ago, and her condition had worsened rapidly. Medical bills piled up, and Jim found himself stretched thin physically, emotionally, and financially. Each day Jim woke at 4 a.m. to knead dough and prep the bakery, hoping for a rush that never came. His hands ached from years of labor, but the weight in his chest was heavier. Most customers were regulars, loyal patrons, who bought just enough to keep the lights on. It wasn't enough to cover Linda's treatments or the mortgage on their modest home. Every evening Jim returned home to sit by her bedside, pretending everything was fine, but it wasn't fine. It hadn't been fine for a long time. One particular Thursday, the sky was overcast, matching Jim's somber mood. The display case was half filled with donuts, glazed chocolate jelly filled, all lined up neatly, almost as if begging to be noticed. As Jim leaned against the counter, wiping his flour-dusted hands on his apron, he stared out the window. The main street outside was eerily quiet. A single tumbleweed could have rolled by, and he wouldn't have been surprised. That's when he noticed him, a tall figure, dressed simply in a black hoodie and jeans, was approaching the bakery. His steps were unhurried but purposeful. Jim squinted, noting the man's youthful features. As he pushed open the door, the bell above jingled softly, announcing his arrival. Morning. Jim greeted, masking his weariness with a polite smile. The young man nodded a quiet acknowledgement. But there was something striking about him. His posture was confident, but his expression carried a quiet kindness that set him apart from the usual customers. He walked slowly to the counter, scanning the display case with an almost curious gaze. Jim had seen all kinds of people walk through his doors over the years, but there was something different about this one. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but Jim didn't dwell on it. For long customers were rare these days, and he wasn't about to scare one off. The young man didn't rush to place an order. Instead, he took his time, his sharp blue eyes scanning each row of donuts, as though deciding on something far more important than pastries. Jim stood patiently, his hands resting on the counter. Though his curiosity was growing. "Got a favorite?" Jim asked. Breaking the silence, his voice carried a hint of warmth, an attempt to lighten the heavy air between them. The man glanced up, his gaze meeting Jim's for a brief moment. There was an intensity in his look, not intimidating but thoughtful. "Not sure," he said softly, his voice calm and measured. "What do you recommend?" Jim scratched his chin, chuckling lightly. "Well, the jelly fields are popular. People say they remind them of their childhood, but if you want something classic, you can't go wrong with a glazed." The man nodded thoughtfully, then shifted his attention back to the donuts. "You've been here a long time?" he asked. Jim raised an eyebrow, surprised by the question. Most people didn't care about the history of his little bakery. They just came for coffee and snacks. But there was a sincerity in the man's tone that made Jim answer honestly. "Yeah, almost 30 years," Jim said, glancing around at the well-worn counters and fading wallpaper. "My wife and I started this place together. She used to handle all the decorating. She's got an eye for that sort of thing." His voice faltered slightly, and he quickly busied himself, rearranging some napkins on the counter. The man noticed but didn't press further. Instead, he leaned on the counter, tilting his head slightly. "She doesn't anymore." Jim hesitated. He wasn't the kind of man to open up to strangers. But something about this customer, maybe his quiet demeanor, or the genuine curiosity in his eyes, made it easier to share. "She's not well," Jim admitted after a moment. His voice was low, almost as if saying the words too loudly would make them more real. "Been sick for a while now. I run the place alone these days. Keeps me busy, you know." The man nodded again, this time with a softness in his expression. "I'm sorry to hear that it can't be easy." Jim shrugged, offering a tight-lipped smile. "You do what you gotta do," but his eyes betrayed the weight he carried. For a few moments, there was silence. The only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Behind the counter, the young man seemed to be deep in thought, his eyes drifting back to the display case. Then, as if he'd made up his mind, he straightened up. "I'll take them," he said, his tone decisive. Jim blinked. "Take what?" "All of them," the man replied, gesturing toward the doughnuts. "Every single one." Jim's mouth fell open slightly. You want to buy all the doughnuts? That's over 5 dozen." The man smiled faintly, pulling out a sleek black wallet. "That's fine, pack them up for me." Jim hesitated. He'd had his fair share of pranksters and time wasters over the years, and this sounded almost too good to be true. "You serious?" he asked, narrowing his eyes slightly. The man met his gaze unflinching completely. Jim didn't ask any more questions. Customers like this didn't come along often, and he wasn't about to risk scaring him off. But deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about doughnuts. Jim's hands moved automatically as he grabbed boxes and began packing. The doughnuts, glazed chocolate, powdered sugar, jelly-filled. Each one was carefully placed as his mind raced. Who was this guy, and why in the world was he buying out his entire stock? "You planning a party or something?" Jim asked, trying to mask his curiosity with casual conversation. The man chuckled softly, shaking his head. No party, let's just say I have my reasons." Jim wanted to press further, but something in the young man's tone stopped him. There was a calmness, almost a confidence, that made Jim trust him, even if he didn't fully understand. When the last doughnut was packed, Jim stacked the boxes on the counter. "That'll be $235, he said, still half expecting the man to back out. Without hesitation, the man handed over his credit card. Jim glanced at the name embossed on it and froze. Barron Trump. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. He'd seen that name before, heard it in the news. Though he hadn't paid much attention, politics and headlines weren't his world. Baking and surviving were. Still, he couldn't ignore it. Now, this wasn't just any customer. Barron noticed the flicker of recognition in Jim's eyes, but didn't comment on it. Instead, as Jim swiped the card and handed back the receipt, Barron reached into his pocket and pulled out an envelope. "This is for you," Barron said, sliding it across the counter. Jim stared at it, confused. "What's this? Open it later," Barron replied, his expression unreadable. "Just take the day off, spend it with your wife." Jim blinked, completely thrown off. I can't just close the bakery. I need the money, the bills." "You've worked hard enough," Barron interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "Trust me, it's all taken care of." Before Jim could protest further, Barron picked up the boxes of doughnuts, stacking them with surprising ease, given their weight, and headed for the door. The bell jingled as he exited, leaving Jim standing there, the envelope still in his hand. For a moment, Jim couldn't move. The surrealness of what had just happened was too much to process. But curiosity finally got the better of him, and he tore open the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note and a stack of cash. The note read, "Jim, your story moved me more than I can say. You remind me of what truly matters in life: family, love, and resilience. Take this and use it for whatever you need. Whether it's for your wife's care or just some peace of mind. You deserve a break. All the best, Barron." Jim's hands trembled as he counted the cash. $10,000. He sank onto the nearest stool, his breath catching in his throat. He wasn't the kind of man who cried easily. But at that moment the weight of his struggles and the kindness of a stranger crashed over him all at once. Jim sat there for a long time, the note clutched in his hand, trying to comprehend what had just happened. But deep down he knew this wasn't just luck. It was something much bigger. Jim didn't close the bakery right away. He needed a moment to let it all sink in. The envelope, the note, the money, everything felt surreal. Like a dream he might wake up from at any moment, but as he looked around his little shop, he realized that something profound had just happened. And it wasn't just about the money. Still, he couldn't ignore Barron's words. Take the day off, spend it with your wife. By noon, Jim had flipped the sign on the door to closed. It was the first time in years he had shut down early for anything other than an emergency, with a box of Linda's favorite pastries in hand. He drove home, the weight in his chest easing for the first time in months. Linda was resting in her favorite chair by the window. When he walked in, the sunlight cast a soft glow over her frail frame, and her tired eyes lit up when she saw him. "Jim, what are you doing home so early?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He knelt beside her, placing the pastries on the table. "Something incredible happened today," he said, taking her hand. "A customer came in and bought every donut. Then he left me a gift for us, enough to cover your treatments for months." Tears welled up in Linda's eyes, and she squeezed his hand. Who would do something like that? Jim hesitated, unsure if she'd even believe him. "Barron Trump," he said finally. Linda's jaw dropped, and for a moment they just stared at each other, the weight of those words settling between them. For the first time in what felt like forever, Jim allowed himself to hope. He spent the rest of the day by Linda's side, telling her stories, reminiscing about their early days in the bakery, and laughing over the silliest things. It wasn't just a day off, it was a lifeline, a reminder of what they were fighting for. But the impact of Barron's kindness didn't stop there. The next morning, Jim reopened the bakery, unsure of what to expect. He hadn't told anyone about what had happened, but somehow word had spread. A local journalist had been in the bakery while Barron was there, and had shared the story on social media. By the time Jim unlocked the doors, a line of people stretched down the block. "I heard about what that young man did for you," one woman said, as she placed an order for 24 donuts. "It reminded me to support the people who make this town." What it is, others echoed her sentiments. And for the first time in years, Jim's register rang non-stop. Customers came not just for the donuts, but to offer words of encouragement and support. By the end of the week, Jim had sold out of nearly everything in the shop. Local businesses reached out to collaborate, and even a regional news station came by to interview him. The bakery, once struggling to survive, had become a symbol of hope and community. But as the days passed, Jim realized that the real gift Barron had given wasn't just financial, it was a reminder that kindness, no matter how small or unexpected, can spark something extraordinary. Weeks passed, and the bakery was thriving in ways Jim hadn't seen in years. Everyday customers walked through the door with stories of how Barron Trump's act of kindness had inspired them. Some donated to local charities, others volunteered their time, and a few even started random acts of kindness campaigns in their own neighborhoods. For Jim, the money was a blessing, but what truly stayed with him was the ripple effect of one selfless act. The bakery wasn't just a business anymore. It was a hub of hope, a place where people came to feel connected and inspired. On a quiet Tuesday morning, Jim sat at one of the tables with a cup of coffee in hand. Across from him, Linda smiled, her cheeks rosy for the first time in months. Though her health still required care and caution, the treatments were helping. She was stronger, laughing more, and even joining him at the bakery on occasion to decorate cookies, something she hadn't done in years. "You know," Linda said, her voice warm with gratitude, "what that young man did for us, it reminds me that the world isn't as cold as it sometimes feels." Jim nodded, his gaze drifting to the framed note from Barron that now hung on the wall near the register. Beneath it, a small plaque read, "Kindness doesn't just change a moment, it changes lives." Later that day, as he prepared to close up shop, Jim noticed a young boy hesitating by the door. He couldn't have been more than 10, his clothes slightly worn, and his face a mixture of nervousness and curiosity. "Hey there," Jim said, crouching to meet the boy's gaze. "You hungry?" The boy nodded shyly. Jim walked over to the display case, grabbed a chocolate donut, and handed it to him with a smile. "This one's on the house, you take care of yourself." "All right." The boy's face lit up with a grin as he ran off. Clutching the donut like it was a treasure, Jim stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him disappear down the street. As he turned back to close up for the night, Jim couldn't help but smile. The kindness that had walked into his bakery that day with Barron Trump hadn't just helped him, it had reminded him of who he was, and the power of giving, no matter how small the gesture. Life would always have its challenges, but Jim knew now that even in the darkest times, there was always a light waiting to be shared. And it was up to each of us to carry it forward. If this story inspired you, take a moment to reflect on how a simple act of kindness can change someone's life, whether it's helping a neighbor. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. For more content, please leave your comments and share your experiences. Thank you for being part of Gill Master Stories community. See you soon.